Recently, I made a reaction to Thomas Sowell talking about the history of Germany that we don't usually learn about in schools. And I feel just from that video, I really did learn a lot. I learned a lot about Germany and Germans' impact on the world. But I was especially interested in the story of the Germans who moved to other countries, set up their life there, and really had a strong impact on the countries they moved to. And in that video, a few people mentioned another video in the comments for me to check out, and it's this one. It's called The Hidden History About Germany and the Holocaust, again by Thomas Sowell. So let's check this one out. We can see if we can learn anything else, and yeah, you can tell me what you think about it also. Okay, the truth about the Holocaust never taught in school. From the same book as the last time. So yeah, you can tell me what you learned about the Holocaust also.
Fanatical nationalism was at the heart of the Nazi creed. To what extent did most Germans share that creed during the Nazi era? Was it a creed going back into history or continuing on past the Second World War? Patriotism has been common to peoples around the world, particularly in wartime, and especially when people have been led to believe that their country has been attacked. There is no reason to doubt the patriotism of the Germans during the Nazi era, but gauging public opinion in a totalitarian state can hardly be done with any precision. The euphoria with which the beginning of the First World War was greeted in Germany was all too common across Europe at the time. What of Germans outside of Germany, and across a wider stretch of history than a few decades of the 20th century? Despite the tenacity with which Germans clung to their own culture in the farthest reaches of the world, there was no such political loyalty to the German nation or its antecedents. Germans in Russia fought loyally against Germany in the First World War, as German Americans did in both World Wars. No one found it noteworthy during the Second World War that so many top American military leaders were of German ancestry, nor was any question of conflicts of national loyalties raised. In Australia, those Lutheran churches that were subsidized from Germany tended to be sympathetic toward Germany, while those subsidized from the United States were not. Yet, once Australia went to war, even the Lutheran churches that had been sympathetic to Germany before now urged their members to fight for Australia and otherwise cooperate with Australian authorities. The Nazis worked hard to infiltrate German organizations in the United States, Brazil, and Australia during the years leading up to World War II, but with only limited success, despite tactics that sometimes included threats of reprisals against family members in Germany if their overseas relatives did not cooperate. Where German minorities had been badly treated, as in Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, it was a different story. Germans in the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia helped create the crisis that was resolved at the infamous Munich Conference of 1938, where Britain and France agreed that Nazi Germany should take over that whole region of Czechoslovakia. Later, when the German army invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Black Sea Germans welcomed them as liberators, as did some non-German minorities. And then, after the Soviet army counterattacked, more than 250,000 ethnic Germans followed the Nazi army as it retreated back to Germany. During the post-war Red Army occupation of East Germany, tens of thousands of former Soviet Germans were forced to return to the USSR, though tens of thousands of others used false identities to avoid this fate, and still others avoided it by committing suicide. During the war, many Germans in the conquered lands, suddenly elevated to privileged positions as members of the master race by the Nazi occupiers, collaborated actively, leading to a post-war backlash that led to the expulsion of millions of Germans as mass punishment, irrespective of individual guilt or innocence. The question here, however, is not the balance of justifiable or reprehensible behavior on the part of Germans in Europe during a period of several years, but the larger historical question of whether the Nazi ideology and its horrifying consequences represented an enduring set of distinctive characteristics of Germans as a people. Those Germans living overseas, in lands where they had no special grievances and were free to express themselves, showed no such loyalty to Germany as a nation, much less to Nazi ideology, as to sustain a conclusion of indelible cultural characteristics favorable to the values of Hitler and the Nazis. The Nazi amalgamation of nation and race under totalitarian rule, one people, one country, one leader, led to the horror most unforgettably burned into the history of Germany and of Germans: the murder of millions of Jews and others deemed to be of inferior races. Was this the culmination of long-standing beliefs and actions of the German people, or a monstrous new creation of the Nazis? In Germany, as in other countries, there were people hostile to the Jews on religious, racial, or other grounds. Nor were these isolated, anti-Jewish individuals. There were institutions, movements, and political parties hostile to Jews, sometimes bitterly and venomously so. And these included historic figures from Martin Luther to Richard Wagner. But the ultimate question is how all this affected the behavior of the German people as a whole, as compared to other peoples in Europe and elsewhere. Self-aggrandizement and bias against others has been too tragically pervasive throughout human history and among peoples around the world to make it a distinctive characteristic of a particular people or a particular era. However, racism in its modern sense of belief in innate genetic inferiority and superiority of particular races has had a shorter history, dating from the last half of the 19th century, when some regarded this doctrine as a logical corollary of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Hostility to Jews, for example, had existed for thousands of years, but anti-Semitism, in the strict sense of believing in the biological inferiority of Jews as a Semitic people, was one of the offshoots of what was regarded as scientific racism. This new racism that wrapped itself in the mantle of science was neither peculiar to Germany nor limited in its application to Jews. In the United States, some referred to the immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe as the beaten men of beaten races, who would be incapable of being able to be absorbed into American society. The eugenics movement sought to limit the reproduction of inferior individuals and races so as to prevent the lowering of the national intelligence in future generations. Planned Parenthood was founded not simply as an organization for limiting the size of families in general, but more particularly to reduce the reproduction of the black population in the United States, as Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger herself noted. Such ideas were common among intellectuals who considered themselves progressive at the beginning of the 20th century. Ironically, although the logical corollary of this genetic determinism was that national IQs would fall over time, as less successful people with generally lower IQs tended to reproduce at a higher rate than more successful people with higher IQs. Research in the last years of the 20th century showed that scores on IQ tests had in fact risen substantially in more than a dozen nations during the course of a generation or two. The question here, however, is not the validity of genetic determinism, but how widespread and how openly avowed it was during a particular era. Germans were neither exempt from nor unique in their susceptibility to this doctrine. Hitler's racism represented the gutter-level application of an idea discussed in more lofty tones at higher intellectual levels.
It's like you can see how powerful propaganda could be at this time, especially when you compare it to now. We have so much access to information where we can see different viewpoints on things. At this time, people were just being fed information, fed what they wanted to be, what the people feeding the information wanted to portray, and it was much easier to control masses at that time. But yeah, it just shows the comparison with the USA at the same time. Like, this wasn't just a German problem. Like, this racism was widespread again, even with intellectual people at that time, which is quite
racism in our narrow modern sense has been a significant force for a little more than a century, while violent and lethal hatred of other groups goes back thousands of years. There were pogroms against Jews in Europe and similar mass slaughters of Chinese minorities in Southeast Asia, centuries before most people had ever heard of genetics. What, then, has been the record of Germans in this longer and broader history of intergroup hostility, discrimination, and violence? Comparing Germans with other Europeans for the sake of convenience, it seems clear that whatever differences there were historically tended to show the Germans not as intolerant as most Eastern Europeans, for example, toward the Jews. Jews fleeing from Eastern Europe to Germany constituted about 1/5 of the Jewish population in Germany when Hitler came to power. However tragic that was in the light of later events, it was a very reasonable move in light of the differences between Germany and Eastern Europe at that time. Jews were so widely accepted in Germany that nearly half of all Jewish marriages there between 1921 and 1927 were marriages to people who were not Jews. German Jews were noted for being far more assimilated to the larger Western society than were Jews from Eastern Europe, and this was true not only in Germany, but in the United States and as far away as Australia. German-American immigrant communities welcomed German Jewish immigrants as members of their Turnverein, singing groups, and other cultural organizations. 19th century German Jews living in Chile and Czechoslovakia likewise took part in the general cultural life of German communities in those countries. Jewish views of pre-Hitler Germany were very favorable, not only in Germany itself, but overseas. During the First World War, American Jewish publications were so favorably disposed toward Germany that they were investigated and prosecuted for favoring an enemy nation in wartime, leading to the famous clear and present danger doctrine in favor of free speech by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in cases involving Jewish writers, Abrams versus United States and Schenck versus United States. Even some Zionists in Palestine returned to Germany during the First World War to fight for the fatherland. Jews were, of course, not the only targets of racial hostility, nor Germany the only place where such hostility was expressed and acted out. What has been the record of Germans with regard to other racial or ethnic groups in other countries and in other times? We have already noted the cosmopolitan tone that Germans sought to maintain in the face of group identity extremism among Latvians and Czechs, though in both cases the Germans eventually decided that they had to defend themselves as Germans. In the Western Hemisphere, the first anti-slavery meeting in North America was held by Germans in 1688, and Germans in Brazil were likewise opposed to slavery there. A history of the antebellum South referred to a colony of anti-slavery Germans who settled in Texas, as well as Germans in Virginia who were antagonistic to slavery, and Germans in St. Louis who were strongly anti-slavery. When whites in early 19th century North Carolina voted to deny the franchise to free blacks, this disenfranchisement was opposed by voters in almost all of the western counties of the Piedmont region, where the Germans and the Scotch-Irish were concentrated. While Germans were split on many of the complex issues revolving around race and slavery, no prominent German-American leader was pro-slavery, and when the Civil War came, the large German population in Missouri was credited with keeping that state in the Union, despite many Confederate sympathizers among other Missourians.
That's something I never really had any idea about. I never knew that Germans had such, and I mentioned at the start of the video that interested me, Germans moving to other countries and having such a strong impact on that country's culture, like in politics and things, but I never knew anything about their really anti-slavery mentality. It's so long ago as well, such an early time, and they had such an impact on that. They put themselves forward and were brave and willing to put themselves out there and go against this. I think that's unbelievable, fantastic.
As for relations with the indigenous population of the Western Hemisphere, Germans were noted for getting along with the Indians better than other Europeans did, though all had clashes with the indigenous peoples at some point or other. Germans in Paraguay likewise treated the indigenous people in a more conciliatory manner than other Europeans had. In Australia, Germans established missions to help the Aborigines. As noted in an earlier essay, in the German colonies in East Africa, slave traders were hanged on the spot when they were caught in the act. The history of pre-Hitler Germans, whether at home or abroad, can readily stand comparison with that of most Europeans, just as the record of Europeans can stand comparison with that of most other races around the world. That is what makes what happened under Hitler and the Nazis even more chilling. If this could happen with Germans, it could happen with any other people. There were anti-Semites in Germany, as in other countries, and their words can now be read as alarming warnings in light of our knowledge of what lay ahead. But there was little at the time to serve as a credible warning of such a monstrous and almost inconceivable event as the Holocaust. Even if we confine the question to those Germans living in Germany during the fatal dozen years of the Nazi regime, the issue is whether the Germans of that era or even those particular Germans whose votes put Hitler in power, were attracted to him for his racist agenda. In elections held from 1871 through 1928, German political parties explicitly devoted to anti-Jewish principles reached a high of 7% of the vote and a low below 1%. These parties included, but were not limited to, the Nazis. A study of anti-Semitism in Germany concluded, by 1914, the anti-Semitic parties were practically defunct and their press was in ruins. Hitler's speeches during the election campaigns of 1928, 1930, and 1932 made no specific proposals on what he intended to do about Jews. He apparently did not see German public opinion as ready for any of the actions that he would, in fact, later take against the Jews. When the desperation of Germans in the face of severe economic and social crises created by the worldwide Great Depression of the 1930s elevated Hitler from a fanatic in the streets to a dictatorial ruler, the die was cast, fatally. From that point on, it no longer mattered what most other Germans thought, whether about race or war or anything else. But before then, when voters in Germany had their last free choice, what were Hitler's supporters supporting? What did they know, and when did they know it? A study that attempted to answer these questions concluded, middle class and other voters did not vote for Hitler because he promised to exterminate European Jewry. Neither did they vote for him because he promised to tear up the Constitution, impose a police state, destroy labor unions, eradicate rival political parties, or cripple the churches. Even Hitler's Mein Kampf did not forecast these events. During the years leading up to the Second World War, Hitler moved against the Jews in orchestrated stages, allowing him to gauge the extent to which German public opinion supported his actions. A Nazi-sponsored boycott of Jewish stores in 1933 failed so badly that it was called off after 4 days, rather than have it be an ongoing fiasco. Even after 5 years of anti-Jewish propaganda in Germany, when the Nazis in November 1938 unleashed Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, featuring violence against Jews, their homes, and their businesses, the negative reactions of Germans, including some Nazi party members, led Hitler to proceed against the Jews thereafter with as much secrecy as possible. Even when Jews were rounded up and sent off to concentration camps, there was nothing at that point to indicate the grisly fate awaiting them, and it was a crime punishable by death to reveal the extermination program. Rumors circulated, and some undoubtedly knew more than rumors, but rumors and speculations always abound in wartime. Moreover, even those who were certain of what was happening had no ability to stop it in a totalitarian state, and they and their families could pay with their lives for publicly protesting. Even a prominent German Jewish leader like Leo Beck said that he did not know about Auschwitz and the systematic killing of Jews until 1943, even though millions of Jews had already been killed by then. Genocide against the Jews was a government program, not the lethal mob violence unleashed against the Jews in earlier pogroms in Eastern Europe, or against the Armenians in Turkey during the First World War, or against the Igbos in Nigeria in the 1960s, or against the Chinese in a number of Southeast Asian countries on a number of occasions over the centuries. Given the fact that Jews had been stripped of legal protections early in the Nazi regime, any of these things might have been done by the German people. Indeed, Hitler tried to represent Kristallnacht as a spontaneous burst of public outrage, rather than as the staged event that it was. But what the German people did not do in these circumstances may be more revealing about their own attitudes. None of this denies that there were anti-Semitic fanatics in Germany, both in the Nazi Party and among the German public. It simply makes the dimensions and duration of anti-Semitism among Germans at large subject to question. What must also be...
I think from this, you can kind of see, such a short period of time, 1933, when they really started to implement this sort of strategy, but you can see that the main reason they got away with it is just purely by inducing fear into the people, fear of death. It's hard when the government of your country is threatening you with death if you even mention anything about this. To be the person that puts your head above the parapet and potentially be killed is a hard thing to do. especially if you don't really know fully what's going on. At this time, it's very hard to know what's going on with the lack of access to information and stuff like that as well. But this is what I never actually knew. This is how the kind of extermination of Jewish people began, but I can see how they managed to do it. But it's quite it's horrendous, really.
Noted is that Jews were a very small minority in pre-Hitler Germany, never as much as 2% of the population, despite their prominence or even predominance in particular fields such as medicine, journalism, or banking. The average German had no compelling reason to be thinking about Jews, one way or another, and indications are that most were apathetic about anti-Semitism, both before and during the Nazi era. Nevertheless, the egregious behavior of the Nazis toward the Jews prompted some Germans to come to their aid, even during wartime, when that meant risking death for themselves and their families. Estimates of the number of Jews hidden in Berlin alone during the Second World War run into the thousands. As for post-Hitler Germany, perhaps the following capsule account from Commentary magazine, published by the American Jewish Committee, is as revealing as any. All told, Germany's voluntary payments for past wrongs amount thus far to more than 55 billion over a period of 6 decades and are unparalleled in history. These were not the reparations after the First World War imposed on Germany by the victorious powers. These were reparations voluntarily paid by a democratically elected German government. This did not, of course, mean that all hostility to Jews had been obliterated in Germany. It does suggest that such hostility was not pervasive nor necessarily greater than in other European countries. It is hard even to imagine such reparations being paid to persecuted groups by democratically elected governments in places like Rwanda, Uganda, Fiji, or other countries where minorities have been expelled or slaughtered.
Okay, very interesting again. I guess this one, whereas the first video was focusing on Germans' impact on the world through their inventions and things that they created and discoveries and so on, this was focusing on Germans as a people. And yeah, I learned a huge amount there. It's a very interesting documentary on the first part of it, learning about how the Germans' bravery in standing up to slave owners and going against slavery, helping the Aboriginal people of Australia. You can see that Germans have always been a brave people, a strong-willed people. Again, I never knew about that. I never knew they stood up to slavery in America, and at that time that must have been something that a lot of people never did. And yeah, you got to give them credit there. Going on to how Hitler got into power and how the Holocaust became what it was. Yeah, it's absolutely frightening. But again, you see that the German people themselves, it was like they were almost forced to accept it. Like it was either they had to accept that or die, basically. It was at that time, it was obviously at this time in the 30s and 40s where people could be controlled like that. Tell me what you learned about that. Tell me if there was anything interesting in this. For me, it was all interesting, but it just reinforces that the German people themselves, as well as having a great impact on the world, of just, yeah, like a very honest and strong-willed people. And yeah, just a very interesting documentary. Tell me what you think about this one. Thanks.